Today I'm starting a short series on one of the most important positions in chess, king and pawn versus king. On the board you can see an example of a king and pawn versus king endgame. These positions come up constantly in real games, and yet it's one of the most confusing endgames for new players. Not only is this endgame very common, but it's important to understand these endgames as a player who is trying to make a strategic decision. For example, you might be in a more complicated endgame with more pieces on the board. You see that you can trade down into a king and pawn versus king endgame, but should you? Here is one example of just such a position. Do you know if white should exchange rooks, and whether or not the resulting king and pawn versus king endgame is a win or a draw? Once you understand these endgames, you'll be able to make the correct decision. If you've ever reached a king and pawn versus king endgame and thought, I don't really know what I'm supposed to do here, you're exactly who this video is for. This series is aimed at beginning players who don't yet feel comfortable with ideas like the opposition, blocking, outflanking. It's also for players who may know some rules about these positions, but don't understand why those rules change as the pawn moves up the board. And the rules do change. And finally, it's for anyone who just wants a refresher on this type of position that decides a lot of games. Now, let's take a look at the big picture. Before we look at any techniques, we need to answer a very basic question. What is each player trying to do? In this position, only one player can possibly win, and that's white. White's goal is simple to state, but hard to execute. White wants to get the pawn to the promotion square. In this case, e8. Promote the pawn, presumably to a queen, and after that the game will soon be over. Black, on the other hand, has no winning chances at all. Black's entire goal is to stop the pawn from promoting and secure a draw. Even though white is the side trying to win, and white has the extra pawn, white's task is actually more difficult. White has two pieces to manage, the king and the pawn, and these two pieces must work together. The king has to escort the pawn down the board. After all, the pawn simply cannot move on its own down the board because the black king will capture it. And so the king has to clear the way, protect the pawn as it moves closer and closer until it promotes. On the other hand, black's task is much simpler. Black has only one piece to manage, the king. Black isn't trying to attack anything. Black isn't trying to create threats. Black just wants to stand in the way. Almost every move black makes in this endgame is defensive. Now here is a key insight, something very important and maybe a little bit surprising. Even though white is trying to win and black is trying to draw, both players rely on the same basic technique. There is one idea that shows up again and again in this endgame. And with this idea, a player can either force a win or hold the draw. If you learn this technique, you'll be able to play both sides of this endgame with skill and confidence. In the next video, we're going to study that idea carefully. That idea is called the opposition. In the next video, we'll see what the opposition really means, why it matters who has the move, and how both sides use it for very different purposes. Hope to see you in the next video.